Hey, welcome to Further in Christendom. I'm your host, Tyler McNabb. I'm here today with a special guest, Fiona Ellis. How you doing?
I'm doing really well today, thank you, Tyler, and I'm really pleased to be here to talk to you about some of these really fascinating themes.
Yes, and I'm glad you've joined us. I've enjoyed your work, both in the edited volume that I did with Victoria, um, that you have a chapter in there, and then the book that we're going to talk about today, God,
There it is.
Value in Nature. So, yeah, let's go ahead and start talking. So this is a really interesting book. Uh, when I came across it, I was like, okay, this seems like to have a kind of a um, very kind of ambitious thesis, I think, to some degree. But I'm like really big on making ambitious theses, so I was excited to read it, and I wasn't disappointed. In uh, the volumes obviously relates to naturalism and theism. What do you mean by naturalism? Just kind of plain, mundane, everyday use of the term.
So that's obviously the really important and good and quite difficult question at one level, because naturalism, the term naturalism is pretty unclear. And, you might think that it's going to be pretty hopeless to try to construct a philosophical position on the back of it, given that there's so much disagreement about the term. Um, I'm going to come in a moment to the question of what we might say at a more positive level about naturalism. But one of the things that I'm wanting to try to do in my book is to call into question the assumption that, for example, the distinction between the natural and the non-natural, or the natural and the supernatural, is entirely unambiguous and clear and agreed upon. And the reason this is quite important to me is that there are quite a few atheists who take the term naturalism and use it to try to establish a position in the atheism-theism debate. Basically, it's a way of ruling out theism. So if you defend naturalism, then of course you're going to be an anti-theist and an atheist. And I think we're all aware that that move is pretty familiar in a lot of philosophy. And, as long as you have your naturalistic credentials, then you're going to be opposed to theism, and you can have some really good arguments against that kind of position, or any kind of religious position. So I wanted to call into question that line of argument, and with it, question a certain way of thinking about naturalism. So, I mean, before we came onto Zoom, I was trying to think about some helpful ways of thinking about naturalism for the purposes of this discussion. And one thing that is sometimes said, and this was said quite recently in the context of somebody thinking about Nietzsche's supposed naturalism, is that naturalism involves the claim that natural life as we have it is the only reality there is, or naturalism involves a commitment to an immanentist position. It involves a presumption of immanentism, or naturalism involves a one-world position. For example, if you take James Griffin's really wonderful book, Value Judgment, he claims that he wants to call into question some reductive conceptions of naturalism that, for example, involve the claim that, as Wilfrid Sellars puts it, science is the measure of reality, of what is that it is, of what's not that it's not. Griffin wants to say that that kind of naturalism that restricts reality to what can be comprehended by the sciences is deeply problematic. But he thinks that one of the motives for that kind of approach is that we don't need to postulate an otherworldly realm to explain what needs to be explained. So Griffin thinks that if you're a naturalist, you're a non-dualist. You're committed to the idea that this world is the only world there is, or natural life as we have it is the only reality. There are different ways of making that point. Now, to me, that's deeply interesting and acceptable. I think that there's something quite dubious about the idea that we should be postulating an otherworldly realm or a second supernatural realm. And, you know, I was brought up by philosophers like David Wiggins, who was one of my teachers, and he taught John McDowell. And these two figures have been dead important to the kind of approach that I've wanted to defend, because it was deeply anti-dualistic or anti-supernaturalistic. But the more I've thought about it, the more I've begun to see that these terms and these distinctions are really, really unclear. And there's a question about what we mean when we say, let's be immanentists. One thing it means is, let's reject the transcendent. And then the question is, well, what does that mean exactly? And a lot of the time, what it seems to mean to a lot of atheists or a lot of naturalistic philosophers is that we've got to reject the idea that in addition to all of this, there is this second supernatural realm or these weird supernatural entities. And, you know, we then face the problem of how this second supernatural realm relates to the natural realm. And we go back to Griffin's worry that we just inherit a load of unnecessary problems about what this realm is, how it relates to this, what there is, you know, the natural realm or the natural world. And we have these epistemological and metaphysical difficulties that we can do without. So I accept all of that, that there seem to be these deep difficulties once we move in a supernaturalist direction. But because I'm really unclear about, for example, how we're to think about the limits of the natural and how we're to think, for example, about what it could mean to bring God into the picture, because I'm questioning the assumption that it means, questioning the assumption that what it means to bring God into the picture is to introduce, in addition to this realm, the natural realm, a spooky or special or problematic supernatural realm, because I'm wanting to reject that dualistic picture, then this allows me to agree with what the typical naturalist says about wanting to reject supernaturalistic frameworks, but allows me to question the assumption that this kind of approach is equivalent to atheism. I think it became a bit unclear towards the end and I talked rather quickly, but that's the general sort of position. So I'm really sympathetic to naturalism, but because I'm unclear about the nature of the distinction between the natural and the supernatural, or the natural and the non-natural, and because I agree with a lot of contemporary naturalists that there's a real question about how we're to understand the limits of the natural world, and a real question mark over whether we should accept the truth of scientific naturalism, you know, science is a measure of what there is, then this opens up a lot of really interesting avenues and possibilities once you start thinking about, you know, in the context of thinking about the limits of the natural world, whether you could, you know, move in the direction of theism, say.
Yeah, no, so that's really good, really helpful. Let me try to phrase everything up, summarize everything up in at least a couple key points up, and let me know if I'm understanding it correctly. So the idea here is, yeah, naturalists are like, hey, you have this extra spooky ontology stuff in addition to the physical realm, the realm of our experience. We got to postulate that there's God, and God is understood here as kind of like an extra object, right? Among the other physical objects. Like you got physical objects, you, me, the computer, the chair here, right? And then you've got like these kind of spooky immaterial objects, you know, God and whatever else we want to throw into that category. And so you're gonna have to like bifurcate the reality of objects into two: physical objects and divine or immaterial objects. And maybe that's not such a good idea. Maybe there's metaphysical and ontological issues that emerge from that. So in the sense that a naturalist wants to deny that, you're happy with denying that. Um, and yet you're kind of uncertain about what you're committed fully to, right? Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, so something like that. And you know, what you were saying calls to mind Mackie's argument from queerness, doesn't
Mm,
it?
yeah.
And we're familiar with the idea that a lot of philosophers have said that values are too queer to be part of our ontology. You know, it looks as if they're these weird entities wafting
Hmm.
by in addition to all of the other things that we can comprehend scientifically. And I think the line I would want to take is that once you move away from the scientific assumption that
Hmm.
the only respectable things in reality are the things that can be comprehended wholly by science, then you can open up the possibility that there are more dimensions of existence, because you can no longer block the possibility of that being part of reality, or say it's too queer to be part of our ontology because it can be part of our ontology only if it's scientifically comprehensible. Then you can open up I mean, you just end up with a much broader picture of what counts as non-queer, if you want to put it in Mackie's terms. And then you can say something like what Mark Platt says in response to Mackie's argument from queerness, which is the world's a queer place. I mean, that will be another way of responding to
Right,
it.
right, right.
So,
So
yeah.
take the sort of very scientism versions of naturalism and call it like naive naturalism for our sake, right? You then motivate, you have a couple chapters on this kind of more expansive naturalism. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I guess going back to the people who originally inspired me. So if you take somebody like Wiggins or McDowell or Griffin, or more recently people like Mario De Caro or Hilary Putnam, all of these people want to reject scientific naturalism. You know, they want to reject the problematic assumption that science is the sole measure of reality. And they reject that on the ground that, you know, there are no good scientific or philosophical arguments for insisting upon that restriction. Once you drop that restriction and allow that there is more to reality than what can be comprehended by the scientist, and allow that, you know, the question of the limits of science is itself really unclear. You know, there's a certain kind of scientific naturalist that I probably wouldn't take too much issue with. You know, in the book, I considered Peter Railton's rather expansive scientific naturalism that seemed to be pretty sensible in many respects. But once you allow that there is more to reality or more to the natural world than what can be comprehended by the scientist, then you can start thinking about things like the moral dimension of experience or the spiritual dimension of experience or reality, and allow that there are different levels of explanation that can allow us to make sense of these dimensions of reality, even if they cannot be wholly comprehended in scientific terms.
Okay,
You know, we might
yes.
be able to explain things on their own level of explanation rather than insisting upon these reductive style explanations that seem to be in danger of removing our subject matter.
Right, right. And just being so narrowly defined, maybe you even have certain self-defeat worries, or you have worries that it's going to cause skepticism about all sorts of different beliefs that we have. So kind of expanding naturalism to not be so naively scientifically, and maybe then is there room for theism? At least maybe something like an expansive naturalism, even if not expansive naturalism. Can you go ahead and take us there?
Yes, so I would want to say that there is an expansive naturalism that is compatible with theism. And the real question here is, what's it mean to bring God into the picture? Now, once you've got away from the kind of dualistic framework according to which it's a matter of introducing another item a problematic big item in addition to all of the other things that we might be more happy with. Once you've got away from that assumption, so as I put it in the book, and I was taking some of this from the theologian Herbert Mcab, God and the world doesn't add up to two, or don't add up to two. There's a question about what it means to bring God into the picture. What kind of model could be helpful here? There are models, for example, the relation between substance and property, where substance and property are not two distinct entities. Maybe that's a helpful way of beginning to think about the God-world relationship. I mean, that's another complicated question. But for the purposes of answering your question, once you question the assumption that you're absolutely clear about what it means to bring God into the picture, it's not a matter of trying to justify the inclusion of a seemingly highly problematic entity in addition to everything else. Then there are certain paradigms within philosophy and theology that can be really helpful here. And one thinker that was very important to me in God, Value and Nature was Emmanuel Levinas, because he was really cagey about how much we could really say in the context of talking about God, and wanted to be, ultra apophatic about it. But rather interestingly to me, he thought that, we can say very little about God, but our only hope, if we're going to kind of give any kind of content to theism, is to work at the level of morality or ethics, as he put it. And he says things like, to know God is to know what is to be done. And we've got to move away from the assumption that learning about God or knowing about God is a matter of somehow learning to represent an object to a subject. It's not a matter of representing a special kind of object.
Right.
Then the question is, so where does that leave you? God's not an object. It's your relation to God has something to do with your relation to morality or your relation to value. And it was at that stage that I wanted to take on board everything that the expansive naturalist like Wiggins, McDowell, Griffin, De Caro, Putnam, etc., everything that they want to say about the natural world as a value-involving world, and try to make sense of the idea that once you make that move and accept it from within a non-scientific framework, so you've allowed that science is not the sole measure of reality. You've allowed that the world is a value-involving world, and values are to be explained at their own level of explanation, a non-scientific level of explanation, which is appropriate when, for example, we're trying to make sense of what it could mean to see value in the world, to be motivated to do the right thing, etc. Try to make sense of all of that, grant that there's more to explanation than scientific explanation. And then you're left with the question, what does that have to do with God? And I think that, a really exciting possibility is that what has already been said at this level is already enough to be able to make sense of a theistic framework. Now, that can sound outrageous. I'm saying, or I'm suggesting that maybe it makes sense to suppose that the expansive naturalist is a closet theist by virtue of being an expansive naturalist. And, it sounds like I'm making a really cheap move. I'm bringing God in, I'm sneaking God into the picture in a really illicit way. And, I can see why somebody might think of it in those terms, but, take Wittgenstein's duck rabbit figure. Maybe there's a way of understanding that move which can involve an appreciation of its theistic potential. And that's what I'm wanting to say. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's getting this kind of what I call BlackFR kind of Thomism view, though obviously Thomism isn't necessary. I would just call it kind of like a maybe pseudo-Dionysius type view of God, where God is not a thing, rather he is the grounding of all things. And if he's the grounding of all things, he himself is not a thing, right? That's kind of McCabe's reasoning. And viewing God not as an object. And so in this case, when we're doing science or when we're looking for explanations, we can explain the world by various parts of the world. And we can have these kind of first layer, second layer type explanations that just feature the physical world or what have you. But at the end of the day, there's the age old question: why is there something rather than nothing, right? Why does the universe exist when it doesn't have to? And that's kind of the appeal to God. So if the expansive naturalist is going to allow for ethics and other ways of knowing and other aspects to our reality, a spiritual aspect of reality, then God's not far off. Is
No,
that?
that's right. That's right. And the other thing is, it's something like metaphysics, in the sense in which we're using it here, can only take you so far, and explanations can only take you so far. And one of the things behind a more Levinasian way of looking at the move towards God is that really you can only begin to appreciate what's at issue here by thinking about it in more practical rather than theoretical terms. You know, the question of God becomes a more practical question rather than the theoretical one. It's tied up with what it means to be human, and what it means to be, what it means to be a good human being as well, and what it means to be moral. So I think that that's really, really important to all of this. And it reminds me of something else that's been important. So Simone Weil in her notebooks says something that is really striking. She says God has to be on the side of the subject rather than on the side of the object. And it's back to that old theme that we've got to get away from the idea that God is an object or a represented subject.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that we're defending a form of anti-realism, because we're trying to articulate that thought from within a very different framework. It's more that I mean, what she goes on to say when she said God has got to be on the side of the subject, she talks about the way in which the subject responds in a loving movement towards another subject, and somehow partakes in, not exactly her words, but partakes in the movement of God's love as she moves towards the other subject in love. And it's this kind of, or I suppose, a Neoplatonist idea, amongst other things.
Yeah.
What it means to relate to God is to somehow share in this movement of love, which is enacted when you move towards the other person in this love-involving movement. Now, that all sounds ultra metaphysical, doesn't it, at one level? But I suppose I brought the idea of love into it, and this is something that I want to spell out a bit more in my next book that I'll talk about in a minute. But it's the idea, taking us back to morality and the moral relation and Levinas. What's turning out to be important here is not what I can explain from a theoretical point of view about the nature of God, but more what it means to be a moral subject in the natural world, and how we're to understand the limits of that morality and the limits of love and the theistic potential that can be built into some of the answers that you might try to give to that question, albeit in an ultra grappling, pretty hopeless at one level way, because there are huge limits to our knowledge in this context, which I suppose would be another reason for wanting to settle on the practical dimension of all of this.
No, really, really interesting stuff. So in some of my work, I look at this kind of like Herbert Mcab type view of God and try to argue that various Eastern traditions are actually consistent with this notion, right? That it's this more viewing God as an object that's not consistent with Taoism or with Buddhism or whatnot. I think when I read your book, I was just like, oh my gosh, like this is kind of like another fruitful outbringing of that kind of project, a view of God that allows consistency and convergence from the theist with their counterpart. And so really enjoyed the book. But you said you're working on another volume right now. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes, and I haven't read your book yet, and I was hoping to have read it before we had our conversation. But it sounds, from what I know of it already, really interesting and really relevant. And I guess you would have some interesting takes on some of the questions that are motivating the next book. So the next book is called The End of Desire, Meaning, Nihilism and God. And it's a book about, and I'm halfway through it at the moment, it's a book about the meaning of life and the
Mm,
problem of nihilism. And really it's God, Value, Nature Part 2 in
mm,
one sense. So I've been really interested by some fantastic work that has been done in some contemporary Nietzschean scholarship, where certain scholars have grappled with the problem of nihilism, which is obviously central to the problem of meaning. You know, one understanding of nihilism, nothing has any meaning, or nothing has any meaning anymore. And that's really interesting and important and difficult to get your head around. But what some of these philosophers have wanted to say, for example, Robert Pippin, is that the problem of nihilism is a problem of desire. And there is a question about what that means. And one difficulty here is that the notion of desire, as you know, is really complex and it can mean lots of different things. Are we talking about appetitive desire? Are we talking about the kind of desire that certain Buddhists think that we should transcend? Or are we talking about the kind of desire that's central to figures like Plato and the
mm.
Neoplatonists? You know, it's that through which we relate to the good or to God. You know, I think it should be clear from what I said earlier that I think the distinction between good and God is kind of blurred, and it's not an absolute
Right,
distinction
right.
in a way that it's not for the typical theist, obviously. So these Nietzschean scholars are operating within an atheistic framework, and that's kind of taken for granted by a lot of these thinkers. Pippin says that the problem of nihilism is a problem of desire. There are other Nietzschean scholars like Paul
Mm,
Katsanis and others who've defended a version of this claim. And the idea is something like this. After the death of God, we can no longer desire, one version. Or after the death of God, we can no longer desire in the right sort of way.
mm.
And the first thing is of huge interest to me is how we're to think about the death of God and how that ties in with the kind of position that I'd want to adopt with respect to the God question.
I see.
Because at one level, I'm committed to rejecting the death of God thesis.
Mhm.
But as you know, and as everybody who listens to this conversation will know, the question of what we mean by the death of God is really unclear, and theologians have articulated it in very different ways. And in Nietzsche himself, it's really unclear. But what is absolutely clear from Nietzsche is that the problem of nihilism and the supposed death of God, these are really important and massive difficulties and questions and problems, and tied in with the question of, you know, it's kind of a cultural phenomenon and a problem of value and a problem of desire. So I'm trying to get my head around what kind of a problem this is. If you don't commit to the assumption that atheism is just a done deal,
Right.
and you think that the God question needs to be rethought.
Uh-huh.
So that's one side of what I'm grappling with presently. But the other side is, so what is this problem of desire? What's it mean to say that we don't desire in the right sort of way, or that somehow nihilism, as Pippin puts it, involves a failure of desire, a failure of erotic desire? Is it something like, if we get rid of God, somehow the state of mind, the desire which attuned us, or which somehow made us properly human, and which put us in touch with value, is somehow somehow no longer possible?
Right.
And you know, the theist response might be, oh yeah, if there's no longer, if the good no longer exists, then of course you're not going to be able to be attracted to it anymore.
Right.
But I think that perhaps my hopelessness at even trying to articulate these points very clearly makes clear that there are all sorts of unresolved issues and assumptions that need to be untied here. And so just to try to summarize a bit of what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to get to grips with the question of what it could mean to say that the problem of nihilism is a problem of desire, and linking that up to the Platonist or theistic assumption that desire is a state of mind through which we relate to good, to God, or to both of those things, and trying to clarify what it could mean to say that somehow that kind of attraction is no longer possible, or that it needs to be rethought and reconfigured in the light of the realization that we can no longer make appeal to God for good in this context.
That's
Does
really, yeah,
make
no, that's really interesting. So you said you're halfway done the volume?
or say 3 chapters into it. I'm tying this up with the in the first chapter with quite a lot of stuff from people like Iris Murdoch and Joseph Pieper, and the idea that we need an
Yeah.
ampler conception of philosophy, and where a really interesting figure like Nietzsche comes into all of that, and yeah, the desire question as well.
That's really good. That's really good. I look forward to reading that. Thank you so much, Dr. Ellis, for coming on, and do let us know when more of your work comes out.
Thank you. Great to talk to you, and I'm really looking forward to reading your book and perhaps having another conversation.
Indeed. Take care.